Looking at the pricing, demand, and consumer searches, obviously houses are flavour of the month, well, not of the month, of the year. Was this trend happening before COVID? You know, a lot of people talk about the high street dying a death. Well, that was already happening and COVID had just sped that up. Was this a trend that was already happening? Do we foresee it carrying on? Grainne, what's your view on that?
Well, when we look at the kind of end product, which is pricing, gives us a good idea of what was happening in the market. And house prices, that's for houses, was up about 1.9% in the year to June last year. Flats were up about 1.4%. In the year since then, we can see prices for houses are up 7% or more, and the prices for flats are still growing at 1.4%. So you really feel it's a pandemic trend for this search for space, more inside space, more outdoor space. I do agree with Chris. We're not in a state where we've had a big shift and it's going to stay that way. People have made a decision to move house. I mean, they'll be looking into the medium term. You don't get a mortgage and move and uproot your family to do a short-term move usually. So people will have looked through what's going on for them work-wise and family-wise and wanting to be in a different location. There is definitely some of that still to come. More offices are now, for those office-based workers, more offices are confirming what the next year or the next 2 years are going to look like. So I definitely think there's more of that trend to come. However, in the rental market, which is the quickest market to react to whatever's going on, we can see that there's a building demand now for apartments in city centres, which have been affected by COVID. So you would expect that the sales market will start to follow suit. And in London, particularly, international market, when you have that global travel back, you would expect to see that demand start to build again in the centre of town.
Thanks, Grainne. Chris, what's your view on search behaviour and whether or not we'll see this staying the same or levelling off?
Yeah, well, I think as sort of Grainne said there, there were definitely trends that were active prior to COVID, irrespective. And I think if anything, a lot of what came out of COVID was an accelerating effect as opposed to a complete pivot in a different direction. If you were to single out apartments specifically, there were some underlying things at play way before COVID. Whether that was the cladding issues that were happening or the issues around leaseholds. There was negative press in that in the space, and that was stabilising prices. But you did also see that in the chart I showed earlier in terms of search demand, it is still a relatively resilient market. There are less fluctuations in the market, and although certainly this year there has been a slight decline in interest in specifically apartments, I think overall it's unlikely to stay that way, and it's likely to stabilise into that position that it's been in for a kind of really long period of time. And I kind of alluded to it at the end that I think a lot of this is dependent on what happens with places of work and how that shifts. Because if there is a sanction to be in a city centre to work for a period of time, then that will have to change people's buying decisions and moving decisions. And also, I think you saw on one of the other slides I was showing in terms of the buyer preferences, you can see that year on year how quickly those preferences can change. And there's it's very conceivable that next year or the year after that, there could be emerging trends around, well, actually, I quite like the idea of being connected, and I quite like the idea of being close to a station, and I quite like the idea of socialising, and those things could start to emerge and shift the paradigm again. So I personally think that there's a lot of long-term underlying things that were in play anyway and will likely default, for the most part, back to those.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. I think what was fascinating about our review data, looking at it over lockdown, is reviews from residents in apartment buildings really appreciated the sense of community and coming together within them. And that a lot of that was actually down to the management teams that successfully pulled that together and reacted to COVID proactively. It was a nightmare across the industry, for everyone to manage to keep people safe, but particularly in high density apartment schemes. I think residents felt that management teams in apartment buildings went above and beyond to try and do that. In a lot of cases, it had a great impact. I also think, you know, we can see from our data that there are some key points to bring through if you are marketing an apartment development that is important to resonate with people, to make them realize, to pull them back in. I mean, really what we're talking about is city living and country living, you know, but around housing types. And I totally agree with you, Chris. We've already seen, we're conducting a number of surveys and review acquisition processes in London and cities across, and that feeling of, oh, you know, I've got my city back and this is opening up. I really do feel that's going to feed in to everyone's psyche. We'll see that shift.